And this is the Stella Culinary School podcast, found online at stellaculinary.com. My name is Jacob Burton. Thank you so much for joining me once again in this episode. So coming up, we're going to be talking about food safety and reheating food, retherming, and some of the concerns that you may have with that. Then a quick segment for all of those people who are out there listening to the podcast thinking that they might want to be a chef, and should they be changing careers, right? Maybe you're in a certain job and you want to take the leap, and we'll talk about that and some of the things that you should be concerned about or just aware of, right? Then talking about how fat affects breads and different ratios you can use. And we might finish the whole thing with another Anova Culinary update, which we'll keep short. And we'll see how things go. And also, the most important part, you, the live listener and viewer of the Stella Culinary community, coming at you live from the Stella Culinary Facebook group. Your questions and comments will be addressed. We may go off the rails as we commonly do, just for fun. So that is the plan for today on this beautiful Friday morning. But real quick, before we get into our first segment, I just wanted to, a couple of housekeeping notes. As we continue to grow, it's helpful to kind of keep the community informed as to what's going on with the podcast and how we're growing. Now, when I post this video podcast to the YouTube channel, I inevitably get people saying, hey, Chef, it sure would be nice if you had timestamps and segments and things of that nature. To which I say, do you know how much time that will take? Right? It's kind of like the segment or the clip in, what is that, Casino, where you got Robert De Niro telling the baker, I want an equal amount of blueberries in every single muffin. Equal. And then this poor baker's looking at him, do you know how much time that would take? So there is a concession. Now, I cannot give you timestamps yet, but first of all, let me back up just for a quick second. So this podcast, the Stella Culinary School podcast, is engineered and was always sort of created to be an audio podcast. So this long-form sort of culinary discussion content you can always take with you on the go, right? We're available in all the major podcasting platforms. So put it on your phone, download it. You can subscribe to the podcast on the app, and then you can listen to it throughout your day. There's no real reason for you to sit here and stare at me. Some people enjoy it, right? Because I will do my best to paint that visual picture in your head verbally, right? Now, there are some people who like to watch the actual YouTube video or the live video from start to finish, which is awesome. And that's why I post this in the first place. So if you're watching this on YouTube right now in the replay and you're saying, I really wish that I could just, take this on the go with me. Well, you can. So just go ahead and subscribe to the audio version of this. Now, with that said, while I will not at this time give you timestamps, I will, and I already have started the process of going through and segmenting the podcast into smaller clips that will then be posted as their own individual segments. So that way you can say, hey, when Chef talked about that alkaline brine, I want to revisit that. I don't remember what episode that was in. And honestly, it's my podcast, and sometimes I have a hard time recalling the episode and where in that episode it is. So I'm working on that behind the scenes, so I will be giving you segments. And also, too, to help kind of keep things focused and broken up into those individual segments, I will be accepting your segment ideas because there are recurring themes that we continually talk about on this podcast. So the idea behind that is, once we have sort of a segment theme, it won't be something that we talk about every single episode necessarily, but when we do, we'll tag it as that segment. Say like the segment coming up, we'll call it like, so you want to be a chef, right? So that'll be all the people that actually want to work professionally in a kitchen. We'll throw them a segment here and there, and then you can go to the YouTube playlist on the live channel, and you can go straight through and watch all the segments on being a professional chef, or all the segments on the Unova combi oven, so on and so forth. Also, too, this podcast is brought to you by the Stella Culinary Bootcamp, online culinary curriculum. Now, I will possibly in the future take on advertisers, but it's has to be on our terms, right? Not only my terms, but our terms as a community. But the best advertiser I've ever had as far as revenue for this show has been the Stella Culinary Bootcamp, the online bootcamp. So if you are interested, it is a paid premium product. It is my it's about 8.5 hours of me lecturing through the F-Step curriculum at a live boot camp. So you hear the questions from the audience, which is basically 12 students who were there in person taking this week-long intensive course with me. And the revenue from that goes directly back into the show to fund the show. The reason why I'm bringing that up, not only because it's, what supports the show, is because I just made another large purchase for some more equipment for the studio. We're continuing to build the studio out. And so starting next week, if I have time to set everything up, we will have multiple monitors that allow me to check the chat a lot easier. And we will start piping into the video broadcast some visual elements. And I got lots of cool ideas for that. And I'd have one segment planned for y'all that I think you're really going to enjoy. But there is a bit of a visual segment or a visual aid that segment will need. So I will not spoil that for you at this time. All right, so let's hop right in. Our first segment is going to be food safety and specifically reheating food. I got a great question here from Leo who sent it in via email. So if you do want to email me, jacob@stellaculinary.com. Pretty easy to remember, and I do check and read all my emails. I tend to get buried sometimes. Again, this is my fun passion project, my day job as an executive chef. It keeps me busy, so I can't always get back to you in a timely fashion, but I do read all your emails, and I enjoy them when they come in. So, Leo asks, reheating food. I've heard some people that you should, or I've heard from some people that you should not reheat food that has already been reheated. Is there any truth to that? Intuitively, I can't see any reason why that should be the case. Last episode, you were talking about par cooking your vegetables. When you actually cook them, you'd be reheating something that's already been heated. Some people say that rice is especially bad to reheat multiple times. Even that, you should not store rice in the fridge and reuse later. Would there be any scientific reason as to why you would not reheat food multiple times? Would it be different if you use a microwave versus a stove / oven heat? And I'm going to circle here the rice so I don't forget about that, because we want to circle back around on the rice side. So the reason why people instruct you not to reheat food, and it's kind of it's the same reason why people instruct you, or why they you'll see instructions for cook your turkey to 185 or cook your turkey to 165. Now, we all know that the salmonella, right, in chicken or in turkey, it dies on a thermal death curve. So if you cook your turkey or your chicken to 150 and hold it there for, I think it's like 8 minutes. Don't quote me. You can look this up. You can Google it. Just Google salmonella thermal death curve. And this is why we can get away with sous videing a chicken breast at 140 degrees Fahrenheit for 4 hours, right? Far below the 165 temperature, because if you hold it there for long enough, you're going to kill whatever salmonella is there, right? And so the reason why they tell you to cook your chicken internally to 165, or sometimes they even say your turkey to 185 because they really don't trust your ability to take a temperature, is to limit their own liability. All right? It's really that simple. They're trying to keep you safe and also really, honestly, keep themselves safe and keep themselves from being sued. So what you really need to know about is something that we refer to in the industry and in our food safety training as time temperature abuse. And this is basically a temperature range in which if you leave food in there for an extended period of time, it allows, or you have a higher rate of bacterial growth, or the possibility of bacterial growth. Now, in general, when you have whole mussels or just anything, right, bacteria doesn't really transfer too far into a piece of meat or any sort of fruit, vegetable, or food product that you'll be using. So all of that bacteria is generally going to be on the surface. Now, the moment you slice something, right, you have your knife hitting the surface first, cutting through an object, and carrying the bacteria internally. So the moment you start cutting something up, you are introducing bacteria to the internals of that item that you're cutting. This is why with ground meat, they always recommend, like, so ground beef or just ground meat in general, they always recommend a higher cooking temperature, right? You normally see, cook your burgers to 165. This is because what you're doing is you're taking this whole muscle meat that has bacteria, possibly. There's always a little bit of bacteria, right? So it's just really kind of a conversation, how much bacteria does it have? And you're taking this whole muscle meat and you're passing it through a grinder, which is basically a spinning blade that chops it up or minces it very fine and extrudes it through a die. And so you're taking whatever bacteria was on that surface and you're spreading it across the ground meat. So now it has more surface area to grow on. Also, too, if it's being ground improperly, which doesn't really happen much in commercial environments, the friction from the grinding, and if it's sitting at room temperature for too long, can heat the meat and put it in that danger zone, which we'll address here in a second. But our starting point is killing bacteria and not allowing bacteria to grow. So again, there's bacteria on everything, right? It's a matter of how much bacteria is allowed to grow, and you reach a certain tipping point to where now if you eat that food item, you're going to become sick. So the time temperature abuse, or the time temperature range, is, for my old schoolers out there, right, 41 degrees Fahrenheit to 140. Now, recently they changed that to 41 degrees Fahrenheit on the low side and 135 on the high side. And there's some other temperatures that you need to be aware of. But basically, what you're trained as in a professional kitchen is any item that's left within that temperature range for more than 4 hours is not safe to consume, right? And this is more perishable stuff. Obviously, leaving your apples at room temperature on your counter, for more than 4 hours isn't going to kill you. But in general, your highly perishable things like your milk and your meat and things of that nature, between 41 degrees Fahrenheit on the low side and 135 on the high side, 4 hours, and you got to toss it, okay? Now, again, this is the equivalent of them telling you to cook your chicken to 165. So if you're at home and you have a steak on the counter and it's for 6 hours, right? Is it going to kill you? No. And especially because any bacteria that's growing is going to be on the surface of the steak. And the moment you sear that steak, you're searing that surface, it's going to instantly or almost instantly kill that bacteria because you're throwing it into a hot saute pan or on a grill. We know the Maillard reaction starts to happen around 325 degrees Fahrenheit, depending upon your pH level and all that sort of stuff. And so because of that, your searing or your browning of that meat is going to kill anything on the surface. Even if you were going to poach that meat, right? You take that meat, you drop it into, say, 190 degree poaching broth. Well, 190 is way above 165, which is basically like the top kill temperature for pretty much anything that you'd want to kill. All right. So when it comes to reheating food and storing food and reheating food and storing food, what the concern is, besides quality loss, which is obvious, right? But if you want to eat, shitty dried out meat, that's completely up to you. I'm not eating it. But when it comes to reheating, and cooling, what happens is you have multiple times where that food is within that danger zone, and that danger zone time exposure will stack up, right? So maybe for the first, day one, it's in the danger zone for 2 hours. Day two, it's in the danger zone for another hour, right? On day five, it's been in the danger zone for, 5 hours, and it may be unsafe to eat. Now, rice specifically is a really good substrate for bacteria in general to grow on. And this is why they talk about, don't reheat and cool rice, don't reheat and cool rice. But if you're taking rice and you're cooling it off at, just popping it in your fridge, lid off and letting it cool, taking out portions of that cold rice and sticking it in a bowl and microwaving it is going to be perfectly safe. Or you could take that rice and make fried rice with it. A little side note, if you are making fried rice, the trick is you want to use it the day after. Take that rice, lay it on a sheet tray or in a thin single layer, uncovered in your fridge, and that helps to dry the rice out, which will then absorb your stir fryer liquid. Okay, so that's what you want to be, or that's what you want to take into consideration when reheating food and cooling it off. Now, that's also too why in my stock videos and soup videos and in professional kitchens, they train you to always ice your stocks and your sauces and your soups, because again, you're erring on the side of caution. So and especially when you're making it in volume. So here's the thing. At home, I will admit to making stock, straining it while it's still relatively hot. So I don't put it in like piping hot into the fridge, right? But it's when you're simmering a stock, you're going to strain that stock. And because it was at a simmer, and as we know at sea level, you start to actually boil at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 100 degrees Celsius. So you can say a simmer is probably, anywhere from, when you say those little like percolation bubbles, you're talking 180 to 190, 195-ish, right? So it's still really, really hot. So you strain that. It's probably going to be at 195 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm going to let that sit on my counter for, about an hour while I'm doing other stuff. And it's going to slowly drop down to 165, maybe 140. And at that point, I'll pop it in the fridge. Now, if it's a couple of gallons, I might ice it a little bit, but I'll just let it kind of cool in the fridge, because the next time I use that stock, I'm going to be pulling it out and I'm going to be bringing it to a simmer anyways, killing anything that's growing in there. But, a couple of days later, right, if I didn't cool it off properly, and there was too much bacteria in there allowed to grow, it's going to get funky. Now, luckily, nature was wise enough to put our noses right above our lips, right? So always kind of trust your nose. It sounds like an obvious thing, but there's so many people, they'll smell something or they'll look at something, or they people are so concerned about like sell-on dates and things like that, right? You don't need a sell-on, legally, you need a sell-on date for like chicken and dairy and milk or whatever, right? But unless you don't have a sense of smell, if you put that glass of milk under your nose and give it a sniff, you're gonna know if it's bad or not, right? Poultry, you're gonna know if it's bad or not. So use your nose, use your sniffer, and make your own decisions. Now, another couple of things that you need to be aware of on a professional side is the holding temperature. So when you reheating and holding. So technically, when you reheat something, most health departments, at least the health departments that I operate under in the United States, want you to reheat your food items to 165 degrees Fahrenheit and then hold it above 140, which is, again, that temperature above that time temperature threshold. So if I make a soup, I have to chill it down. I have to chill that soup down within 4 hours, right? Or basically, I have to take that soup from 140 down to refrigeration temperature, 41 degrees Fahrenheit, within 4 hours, right? So I do that with an ice bath, and we're using large Cambros, right? And then the next day, when I go to reheat a portion of it for, say, like the lunch service, we'll bring it to a simmer. Now, technically, you only have to bring it to 165, but if it's a soup, like I can bring it to a quick simmer anyways. We keep temperature logs in our kitchens because it trains the cooks to, temp out that thermometer and log it. And then we hold it in a steam well at least, 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and we check that with thermometers as well, because we're in a professional environment, right? So we have a higher standard. At home, bring your soup to a simmer, and you can serve, and it's going to be just fine. And let's see. If you correctly thaw a frozen steak, say in the fridge, can it be refrozen? I've heard both yes and no. So yeah, you can refreeze meat after you thaw it in the fridge properly, assuming that you don't expose it to time temperature abuse. The issue with doing that is it's going to vastly degrade the quality of your meat. So when you freeze something, right, there's water within the muscle. When that water in the muscle crystallizes into ice, that ice is jagged. So the ice forms, is going to kind of cut into your meat strands. And that's why you can take a piece of beef, right? It's completely dry, wrap it in a Ziploc bag or even vacuum seal it, pop it in your freezer. And then when you thaw it, you'll notice that there's a lot of liquid in there, right? And it's weeping. It's weeping that's caused from basically moisture loss that comes from those jagged ice crystals forming. And then bleeding out, or it's not blood, right? But basically weeping out these juices. This is why in like high-end commercial environments, they have what's called IQF, which is basically stands for instant quick frozen. So you see like shrimp or fish or sometimes meat that's labeled as IQF. It's instant quick frozen, and they use liquid nitrogen or some other really cold temperature system to freeze those proteins almost instantly, because the faster you can freeze something, the smaller the ice crystals are, and the less degradation of quality you have in the muscle, because those smaller, finer ice crystals cut into the fibers less. So at home, where you don't have a super cold freezer and you're opening and closing it, you're getting some ice out, the kids are getting like a little push pop or something, right? So that temperature in your freezer isn't always super cold. So because of that, more ice crystals will form while you're freezing. So then when you take that same beef you thought, and then you go, shit, I'm not going to cook this tonight, I decided to do something else, or we're running late, so I'm going to put it back in the freezer, right? And you pull it out again. When you cook that meat and you eat it, it tastes a little bit drier than usual, even though you hit like a dead on mid-rare or medium, right? That's the reason why, right? Because you went through a couple of freezing and thawing cycles, and you had some weeping, so you lost some juices. So eating cold pizza from the fridge is not a good idea. Of course, it's a great idea. It's fine, right? So you're gonna drop your pizza down to your refrigeration temperature, and it's all good in the hood. Again, there's very few things I can think of off the top of my head that when they go bad, your nose can't smell, right? Your mileage may vary. If you're super paranoid, right, then be paranoid. Take control of your own health. Say we get distracted, accidentally leave a gallon of milk, unopened milk, on the counter at home overnight. Should it be thrown away? I'm going to leave it up to you. I would probably toss it. In the big scheme of things, a gallon of milk isn't, that expensive. It's not worth getting food poisoning over, right? But at the very least, I would keep an eye on it, right? So if I lived by myself and I left a gallon of milk out overnight, or like a half gallon, and I noticed the next day and it wasn't like super sweltering hot in my house, and I put it back in my fridge, I just make a mental note of, hey, this milk might not be good, so when I open up the carton to make my bowl of cereal, whatever, I'm gonna give it a quick little sniff to make sure that everything's a-okay. But at the very least, it's gonna probably turn on you faster. John Fitch asks, sell-by date versus expiration date. It's almost always a sell-by date, right? Unless there's certain products that expire, but it's almost always a sell-by date for freshness. And again, like, I'm not overly concerned about it. And you have to kind of divide professional environments versus home environment. In a professional environment, once it reaches its expiration date, it's out. No questions asked. You write it up as a loss. But also, too, you're going through so much food in a professional environment. If you have food going bad on you or expiring on you, you're not paying attention, right? You're not rotating your product properly. You're way over ordering. So if that's happening on a continual basis, you're screwing up somewhere. At home, again, just kind of use your judgment. Like, bottles of beer have a best by date, things like that. Like, your beer is never going to go bad. It's never going to make you sick. It's just going to taste funky or off, and it's not like Budweiser tastes that good in the first place, right? So, I mean, who gives a shit if your Budweiser's expired? So, use your judgment and use your nose. So Jordan says the issue with rice is that you have to cool it under 20 degrees Celsius as soon as possible, then into the fridge. Otherwise, heat-resistant bacteria that can make you pretty sick, although relatively rare. Heating won't kill those bacteria spores like the standard ones. Yeah. Yep. So that's true, but I mean, it's like, I don't know. In a normal home workflow kitchen, you make your rice, you pop it in the fridge, you let it cool off, you reheat it. I've never taken a temperature of a rice and made sure that it, when it looked at my clock and made sure that it cooled off. And I eat, as you guys know, I eat quite a bit of rice. If I find if I find a piece of freezer burnt meat in the fridge, can it be salvaged for any purpose? Depends on how bad, right? Normally at that point, you want to help it out somehow, and the way that you would help it out is by grinding it up and using it to make meatloaf or meatballs or something, or some sort of stuffing where you can reincorporate moisture by adding, breadcrumbs that you soak in a liquid or something like that. But once it's freezer burnt, and if it's badly freezer burnt and it's like a whole piece of steak, and you try and sear it and serve it, it's just the flavor is going to be off, right? The exterior texture is going to be bad. It's going to be oxidized, and you're going to have a really dry piece of meat. All right. Okay, so moving on to our next segment, right? So you want to be a chef, right? There's a lot of people that listen to this podcast, listen to the war stories, get inspired by the culinary arts, and think to themselves, damn, I sure would like to be a chef. And I can totally relate to that, because that's exactly what happened to me. I wasn't supposed to be a chef. I was in college with like 3 majors because I had no idea what I want to do with my life. And, I decided that, one day, hey, I'm going to take this leap of faith. I'm going to go to culinary school, and I'm going to be a chef. Right? And going to culinary school, by the way, isn't super necessary, which we may touch on here in a second. But this question was spawned by Daniel from Brooklyn, 25 years old, a film school grad, working as a delivery guy currently. And you know what's funny, right, is because of my hobby, which is producing this, making videos, doing podcasts, I always dreamed of going to like a film school, right? It sounds like a fun thing. So now here you have a guy that, went to film school, which is one of sort of my alternative paths that I could have chosen and really enjoyed and been into. And now he wants to be a chef, right? So it's funny, keep in mind when we have these kinds of discussions, right, the grass is always greener. So, but he went to film school, he's working as a delivery driver, he lives in Brooklyn, it's a great email, and he enjoys the F-Step lecture series, and I'm going to hop kind of right down to the final paragraph, to kind of to get to his questions. So he says, I hope it's not too much meandering, but I have to convey the shift that I feel quite profound in me. I woke up one morning, and without knowing it, I just want to cook all the time now. Never what I predicted for myself, but here I am. So I want to get your opinion on what kind of advice do you have for someone considering that career change and wants to cook for a living and work their way up. Because at this point, it feels like it's not even a want anymore. I need to be doing this. What are some of the ways I can get my foot in the door or kick the door down if that's what I need to do? Any advice will suffice. All right. So first, what really resonates with me, and this is going to be super important, is the phraseology of, at this point, it feels like it's not even a want anymore. I need to be doing this. If you're thinking about becoming a chef or changing careers, right, you need to have a deep, deep desire that goes beyond passion, because passion is fleeting, right? You need to have this desire to where this is all you want to do, because you're going to need to tap into that throughout your career. And a lot of people think that by being because they love to cook, that it makes sense for them to, do what they love for a living, which is cooking. But professional cooking is very different than cooking at home for pleasure. A lot of times you are cooking the same items day in and day out, right? Because they're part of your menu. And when you're first starting out, you don't have a whole lot of control over the menu, if any. Line cooks don't have any input on the menu, right? Besides an item that constantly gets them in the weeds and they can't execute, so maybe the chef changes that, right? It's not like you get to express yourself creatively when you're first starting out in a kitchen. Also, we've all heard about the long hours and the standing on your feet and the weekends away from family, the nights away from family, right? So I don't need to beat that to death, but it's definitely a consideration, because there's lots of people who want to get into the industry and they have these ideas of, hey, God, I love to cook so much, so I'm going to go and become a chef and work in a professional kitchen. And what ends up happening is they're absolutely miserable, because it's nothing like cooking at home. I mean, I would love to cook at home all day. Like, if I could just hang out in my kitchen and cook whatever I want and just listen to some music and chill out, I mean, that's very enjoyable to me. And that's a great starting point for your career as a chef. You got to love cooking and you got to want to be in a kitchen, but there's obviously a lot more to it, which we're going to kind of get into. Now, there was a person, I'm going to try and keep it a little bit vague, but a person who was in my culinary class. So when I went to the California Culinary Academy in San Francisco back in the day, there was an individual in this class who was older, probably in their late 30s, hated their corporate job where they were making a solid salary, but not enough to be like, not enough to have fuck you money, right? But enough to, have provide, a good life for their family. And they decided to jump ship, drop the $60,000 and go to culinary school because their dream was to be a chef. They quickly learned that being $60,000 in debt when trying to support a family with children in the Bay Area at that, and then when you get out of school, your best prospects for, at least initially, are still entry-level jobs, making anywhere at that time from $10 to $12 an hour. Things unravel really fast. And from my recollection, the personal life of this person took a massive hit because of this, right? Because that decision didn't just affect this person, it affected the entire family and their stability, right? So those are things that you have to take into consideration, right? You go to culinary school if you decide to go down that path, or you go into a kitchen, you're working super long hours, you're starting out, and you're not going to get paid a whole lot. There's a lot of paying your dues, right? It's skilled labor, and skilled labor that can only really be achieved by repetition, right? It's not like you can go to, it's not like you can go and say, hey, I have a 3-week class on cooking sauté, right? And cooking the sauté line, which culinary schools don't even do, right? They focus on regional cuisines and, they'll show you some techniques, but it's not like, hey, you're going to get your ass kicked on a sauté line for 4 weeks straight, which would be great. Like, that's the class that you need in culinary school. Even like the restaurant classes that they do, right? Where they're like, come to our restaurants and our students cook for you. You got like 30 kids back there, cooking for 50 people, right? It's really not realistic. So you're not getting this skill of actually being a professional line cook until you go into the kitchen. So at that point, you're not super valuable. So you start at the bottom and you got to work your way up. And that's why also too, I don't really recommend that a lot of people go to culinary school, right? In the general sense. I went. Is it nice to put a culinary degree on my resume? Yeah, but that loan was a bitch to pay off too, right? It was really expensive. If you want to go to culinary school, or if you need some education, here's a couple of options. Number one, straight up, the Stella Culinary School universe, it will give you more knowledge. It will give you more knowledge. I promise you that, than culinary school. How could I say that so confidently? Well, number one, I went to culinary school. Number two, I hire and train cooks for a living. And they are, the cooks that come out of culinary school are woefully undereducated and unprepared to be in a professional kitchen. That's just the fact of the matter, right? Now, if you want, the good thing about culinary school is you have a controlled environment where you're allowed to fuck up without the chef wanting to kill you, right? Because you're paying for that pleasure of being able to screw shit up. Okay, so when you're breaking down a chicken, the yield doesn't matter. When you're making a soup, if you over-season it or it's just completely awful, you can throw it in the trash. That's part of what you're paying for, is that waste. In a professional kitchen, that's not going to be allowed, You're not going to be allowed to butcher meat and make soups and make sauces until you're actually trained on it and trusted to do so. And then if you're a young up-and-comer and I want to train you on something, to do something, I have to, in a professional environment, I always have to sort of balance that ROI. Am I going to take 10 hours to train this person on X, which I'm paying them for, right? I'm going to pay them to learn this, right? What's my return on that? Or will I just break it down myself? Will I do it myself? Am I going to make that investment in this person, right? And it's always wise to invest in your people and in training, but you constantly have that ROI, right? That you have to consider as a chef. So that's why so many cooks will kind of hit this wall with like meat fabrication and things of that nature, because they were never allowed to touch the meat because they were never trusted to. So it's catch-22. How can I ever get the experience of cutting meat and yielding, filet mignons off of this beef tenderloin if I'm never allowed to actually touch it? So culinary school is nice for that, right? You're allowed to break down beef tenderloins and ribeye steaks, and you kind of get your hands on it, but it's not enough, right? It's not. I mean, my butchery class was a 3-week class, so it's not like I'm getting a ton of exposure. In culinary school, I was able to break down maybe 3 beef tenderloins total. But it is nice to have that environment. So if you want to go to a hands-on training, I would recommend that you do a junior college, right? Junior college for hands-on training. It's funny, there's a local junior college program we have here in Reno. They asked me to come in as a guest speaker, and one of the first questions I asked this class is, hey, how many of you currently work in the industry? And it's a class of like 25 people. You guys want to guess? You want to guess how many hands went up? 1. 1 hand went up. In that entire class, you had 1 person that was actually working in the industry. Now, when I asked the others what they were doing, right, there's various jobs. Like one was like, doing paperwork at a car dealership or something like that. And I'd say, well, why aren't you working in a kitchen? You're going through a culinary program. And their response to me was, well, kitchens don't pay enough. What do you think is going to happen when you graduate? You think you're just going to get a chef title on your jacket? Right? When you graduate, you're going to, chefs really don't care. Hiring chefs do not care about your culinary degree. Now, before we move on to what chefs actually do care about, one of the best things that you can do for your career path, if you want to be a chef or you're on the path to being a chef, is learn the numbers, right? Now, you don't necessarily need an accounting degree or a business degree or an associate's degree in those fields, right? But you need to learn Excel, you need to learn numbers, right? You need to learn how to cost your food and your labor and all that sort of stuff. And that's something that you should be, if you're a cook right now making $15 an hour and working your way up the line, right? You should be starting your studying on that now. You should be practicing food costing at home on your free time on an Excel sheet, because that is the biggest sticking point, bar none, with your growth from a cook to an actual executive chef. And there's so many people who get their first executive chef job, and they're very, very talented in the kitchen. They know how to lead a team. They know how to cook well, right? They're putting out good food. They can execute, but they don't know the numbers side. And it gets them in a lot of trouble, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much your team loves you. It doesn't matter how good your kitchen is ran, right? If you're not making money, restaurant businesses are businesses, right? If you as a chef are not making a profit, and even the best in the business, we all know that the profit margins in restaurants are traditionally very thin, right? So you have a very narrow target to hit. You drop a couple of points, you're completely screwed, okay? So you have to learn your numbers early and learn them, really focus on them, because that's one of the things too, that as a chef, as much as I would love to teach numbers to every single one of my cooks, I just don't have time, right? Now, I do plan on doing some curriculums on that very topic for StellaCulinary.com, because it's important to have that information out there. And we'll start kind of knocking down some of these subjects in upcoming professional chef segments on this podcast and also on the YouTube channel, right? But what am I going to do? Am I going to take a $15 an hour cook and bring them into my office when they really should be setting up their hotline for dinner service and say, hey, I want you to spend 3 hours and watch how I work my way through this P&L. In an ideal world, I would be able to do that, right? But it's just not, it's not reasonable. I'm going to have massive overtime. The hotline's never going to get set up on time, right? So what I do is I just do it because I know how to do it. It's my job as the executive chef to do it, right? And they set up the line. So that's the biggest sticking point in your growth as a professional chef. So as far as breaking into a kitchen and how to break into a professional kitchen, it's just all about attitude, right? In professional kitchens break people on a daily basis. It's hard work, right? There's no way around it. It's hard work. It's stressful work, right? And people think that they want to work in a professional kitchen, and they just, they're not cut out for it, right? So if you show up with a great attitude, it doesn't matter what position you start as, you're going to work your way up really, really quickly, right? But you have to have a good attitude and a willingness to learn and a willingness to take a beating. And I'm not talking about working for some asshole chef who's constantly screaming and yelling at you, although that may be necessary. Just straight up being honest, that may be necessary. I worked for some great chefs that I learned a lot from that screamed and yelled at me, and it was not fun, right? But here I am today. So, you may have to endure some of that shit. That's just part of the industry, unfortunately. But beyond that, the chef yelling at you is nothing compared to getting absolutely crushed on the hotline during a brunch service or a dinner service or a busy lunch service, right? It takes a lot of mental fortitude. And what people mix up is the fact people like to equate mental toughness with work ethic. And they're two completely different things. Two completely different things. Work ethic is your ability to focus on work and move forward in a progressive fashion. Okay? So think of if you're out of shape right now and you want to run a marathon, okay? You can do that, and you can do it with just work ethic. You don't need to be mentally tough to run a marathon, right? Because you start out slow. You start by running a mile and by 2 miles, and you work your way up. And maybe it takes you a year or 2 years or even 3 years to go from the couch to a marathon, but you work your way up to it by consistent work, by consistently putting in that work, okay? Now, the difference between working your way up and putting in the work to run a marathon and running that marathon and mental toughness is now you're out there running this marathon, right? And you sprain your ankle, or a snake jumps out at you, or you trip and you fall and you cut your knee, right? Or you get a fucking flat tire on your left shoe and you're like, Jacob, that doesn't make any sense. How can you get a flat tire on your fucking shoe? I don't know, but it happens. That's a restaurant. That's a restaurant, okay? In a restaurant, you live in Murphy's world. And what happens is people think that all it takes is getting in there, setting up your line, and cooking, but you constantly have a chaotic environment that's throwing stuff at you. And that's what breaks people, right? It's not a lack of work ethic, which some people also don't have work ethic, right? So they don't last long at all. But you have that work ethic, and you can't handle all the curveballs being thrown at you. And you'll get a lot of them in the restaurant industry. Which is why it was so important that Michael said to me, at this point, it's not even a want anymore. I need to do this. Good. Burn that into your soul. If you really want to be a chef, burn it into your soul, because you're going to need to tap into that resolve in 10 years from now when you are exhausted and you're working another 70-hour week, right? And you got to figure out a way to get your kitchen out of the weeds or bail this person out here and there. Now, as you get better and as you work your way up, you can start structuring your kitchen to run more efficiently and execute much better, right? So what I don't like about chefs is chefs that constantly play the martyr, all right? On your way up, when you're opening a new restaurant, when you're building a new restaurant, when you're creating a new team, if you're going through a rebuild phase because you had some like your right hand man, they left, right, because they're going on to pursue their own career, the next step in their own career, right? That takes, you got to buckle down, right? You got to spend those hours. But if you're working 80, 90-hour weeks, week in, week out for like months, if not years, right, with no end in sight, you're doing it wrong. As a chef, meaning you're the leader of the kitchen, right? This is your universe. You own it. You set it up. You're the one writing the menu. You're the one writing the execution game plan, right? If you're constantly working 80, 90 hours a week as the head chef, you're doing something wrong. So you got to do some soul searching. Stop playing the martyr. Stop telling yourself that you have to work these ungodly hours. I'm an opener, right? I specialize in opening new restaurants, and it's a lot of fun, right? And boy, you will see some veterans break under opening, because you think just a normal restaurant environment throwing curveballs at you is crazy. Try opening a new build out or a remodel, right? There's all sorts of shit that comes your way. And I love that. I love the challenge of it. But what I also like about it is the reward on the back end. I don't have to inherit anyone's bullshit. I don't have to inherit their bad Yelp reviews. I don't have to inherit the stigma of the restaurant, right? It's my system that I get to build, and I get to build it from the ground up. And yeah, there's usually about a 3 to 6 month to sometimes 9-month period where it's just all work all the time. You're just grinding, right? Even at home, you're on your laptop, banging out work, right? But once you have that system built and it's built efficiently, then that system starts to work for you. It's a machine. Think of it as a race car, right? You're putting a lot of work in on the front end to actually build up this race car and all the different components, right? At a certain point, you need to be able to get in that race car, zoom around the track, and then pull into the pit stop, maybe change the tires, change the oil. But if you're rebuilding that fucking engine every single time you take that car out for a run, right? You've built the car wrong. It's the same thing with your kitchen. Once you build up the kitchen or build up your restaurant, if you're constantly rebuilding and retooling every few months, right? You're doing it wrong. So you got to look at your execution and your workflow. So if you want to break into a kitchen, go on Indeed, go on Craigslist, find an open ad for a low-level cook. So the listings that you're looking for are prep cook, garde-manger, which is the entry level in a hotline, right? So you have a prep cook who preps a lot of stuff, garde-manger cook who basically makes salads and puts out soups, sometimes works a flat top, or even a dishwashing position. And dishwashing is great, especially if you're really new to the industry, because all you have to do with dishwashing is get used to standing on your feet and hustling, okay? And you get to learn in a relatively not low stress environment, but what's the word I'm looking for? A low expectation environment, right? Like chefs, as long as the dishwasher is washing dishes in a timely fashion and putting them away and checking off their cleaning list, right? We don't really care what you do, right? We just go do your thing. You're in the dish pit. You're doing a good job, right? So we don't care. So what the dish pit will teach you is, number one, organization, right? Workflow, how to keep that machine constantly moving, how to stack things, and it gets you kind of in the kitchen culture, again, without a whole lot of expectations, and you're used to getting on your feet, and you're working those shifts, and you're thinking of execution, right? How am I going to keep these plates, these different sized dishes and hotel pans moving through this dish machine in an efficient pace? So it's your first foray, it's your first introduction into efficiency. And also, too, you're learning how to clean properly, how to sanitize properly, and a lot of times as a dishwasher, it's going to be your job to go and clean the walk-ins. So that gives you a good chance to go into the walk-ins, reorganize their shelves. I mean, not like, fuck everything up, but you're pulling stuff forward, you're wiping down the shelves, so you get a good sense of the product that's in that kitchen, right? And you're mopping those floors. And I guarantee you bust your ass as a dishwasher for 3 months, right? The next time a cooking position opens up, you're in. And in a good kitchen, here's how this works, right? Say the lead line cook leaves to go be a sous chef somewhere else, right? Well, now your secondary line cook becomes the lead. Your garde-manger guy becomes your secondary line cook, right? Your relief garde-manger guy now becomes the lead of garde-manger, so he's the head of the salad station. And then you have that dishwasher who's been hustling, who's been kicking ass and taking names. You say, hey, you want to come and work garde-manger? You want to come and make some salads for us? Right? And that's how you get your foot in. And then you just keep on hustling and working your way up. And it because of the natural turnover rate in professional kitchens, it doesn't take you that long. You could work from a dishwasher to sous chef in a matter of years without any culinary education, right? But you got to hustle, and you have to have that mental fortitude. Let me say it one more time for the people sitting in the back that think they want to be chefs. You have to have that mental fortitude. You think that you are tough, right? You think you're tough. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to go and train for a marathon. And right before you run it, I want you to hit your knee with a sledgehammer and then go run that fucking thing. Okay? That's what working in a professional kitchen is, right? It's not just being able to show up and do your job. It's being able to show up and do your job and keep your composure when you have these things that were completely unforeseen thrown into your life and thrown into your universe. So Daniel, good luck with the career path change. Now, one last thing that I will offer you. One of the best pieces of advice that my dad gave me when I was like a senior in high school, and I was kind of really angsty and didn't know. I mean, I felt like a lot of pressure to figure out at 18 years old what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And he tells me, Jacob, look, life's long, right? I mean, it could be short, but life's long. You're going to have plenty of time to reinvent yourself. Plenty of time, right? So if you're doing something right now and you don't like it, go reinvent yourself. If you decided that part of that reinvention is working in a professional kitchen, and 2-3 years from now you don't like it, go reinvent yourself. Because what you learn in a professional kitchen is universal, right? You learn that mental toughness, you learn that hustle, you learn how to work under stress, you learn how to deal with all sorts of different things, and you'll pick up some really, really good cooking skills. So then when you move on to your next career, if that's what you end up doing, you'll be that badass guy that everyone wants to go to their house and eat a great dinner, because now you are cooking and executing on a professional level. And we talk a lot about execution on this podcast. We're going to talk a lot more about execution on this podcast. But at a certain point, if you really want to get good at execution, you got to throw yourselves in the shits and go and execute. Now, if you don't have access to working in a professional kitchen, and you really want to get good at execution, start having dinner parties. Have dinner parties every weekend, right? And the first handful of dinner parties, they're going to be a shit show, right? You work your way through it. Also, too, you can go and volunteer in a local restaurant and just say, hey, look, my days off are these. I really want to learn how to cook on a professional level. I'll work for $10 an hour or something, ridiculously cheap. I just want to get in here, give me some stuff that I can prove that I can't mess up. And then you start, maybe working a day or two a week as a prep cook, then a salad guy, and you work your way up. And you can, if you really are dedicated to learning execution, you either got to throw those dinner parties or somehow work in a professional kitchen, because I can only talk to you about execution so much. It's like me sitting here and demonstrating to you how to throw a punch, right? Like I can show you all the different dynamics, all the different fundamentals of throwing. I mean, I can't, but let's pretend like I was a great boxing coach, right? A great boxing coach can show you some really great techniques and give you some good information and help to kind of refine your technique and your movement, right? But at a certain point, you got to get in the ring and throw some fucking punches if you want to be good at boxing. Same thing with cooking and executing, right? At a certain point, you got to get in the kitchen and start executing, all right? So Daniel, good luck with your potential career change. And remember to keep that fortitude. Remember to keep that dedication, right? Because passion is fleeting. Dedication is what you will need to get you through the tough times. All right, let's check. I'm going to just take a second here before we move on to our final segment and look through. One of your last vids, you covered proper venting for a stove. Best decision we made. Yeah, that is the best decision you can make for your home kitchen is before you invest in anything, invest in exhaust fan. Franchise fees create a pretty big barrier to entry for the common restaurateur, though they have well-defined margin guidance and cost measures to monitor how well you are doing in comparison to the other formula shops. I would never well, I won't say that. I have actually thought of potentially in the future buying a couple of franchises. I don't think I'd ever do it. But I'm like, look, if these schlups over here could make a profit off of running this dirty-ass fill-in-the-blank Subway or whatever it is, right? I guarantee you I can run it better and more efficient, right, as with my background as a professional chef. But for the most part, you want to just basically build your career, and leave yourselves options. Also, too, one more thing before we actually move on from this is you want to always, early on, get yourself in the best kitchens possible, right? And you're going to take a hit on your pay for that, all right? But there will come a point where you've moved up in your career, say you're a lead line cook or you're a sous chef, and if you built your way up the line through lower-end restaurants and lower-end kitchens, like brew pubs and like low-end bistros and things like that, diners, right? And there's nothing wrong with working at those places. But if that's how you built your career, then you're going to pigeonhole yourself, because there's a different level to shit in a fine dining restaurant or a fine dining kitchen. And you can always take a step down from fine dining, right? But at a certain point in your career, it's really hard to take a step up unless you want to start at the bottom rung of the ladder again and work your way up. And after a decade of working in kitchens, I guarantee you don't want to do that. So take the pay hit early on, right? Sacrifice that pay early on. Get yourself in the best kitchens possible at the lowest position possible. Work your way up. So that way, if you're like, you know what, like this fine dining shit, like that's whatever, it's not for me, right? I'm going to go and open up a great diner. You're going to be able to execute diner food really, really well because you have all of these different skill sets that you learned from working in a fine dining kitchen. So always try and get into the best restaurant possible early on in your career and cut your teeth there, because again, it's really easy to take a step down, right? But it's really hard to take a step up. And I don't want you to get confused with the fact of, fine dining cooks aren't as good as, diner cooks or whatever. It's a completely different skill set, right? But there comes a certain point of retained knowledge and finesse and things of that nature that aren't necessary in a diner situation or a brew pub situation, that if you're, say, the sous chef of a brew pub and that's all you've ever worked in, and you say, shit, I really wish that I could go work in a fine dining restaurant, especially say maybe like a Michelin-starred restaurant, you're not getting hired as a sous chef, right? You're going to start off as, probably garde manger or maybe like a line cook, a low-level line cook, all right? So make that sacrifice early on. Try and work in the best kitchens possible, so then you're going to have more decisions later on down the road. Okay, so the final one, our final segment for the day, and we're going to have to, so I'm going to need y'all's help with naming these segments, and so we are a big group of breadheads. I know that we have a lot of bread bakers in the audience, so in our Facebook group, or if you want to just shoot me an email, let's come up with a cool, catchy name for our bread segment, so that way we can keep it all organized. So that way, in the future, when people ask about a certain topic that we've already covered, we can point them towards the appropriate segment and tag that segment with the proper tag so it's easier to find. So this is for our mod extraordinaire, Quat Mullo, who helps so much around here. I can't thank her enough for what she does. And she wants to know about how fat affects bread in a broader sense. So, how does fat affect your bread dough? And once you understand this, it's really going to open up to you a wide world of bread baking, because you're going to understand the versatility of it. So let's start with our basic baguette, right? Which has no fat in it, right? So your basic baguette is a 60% hydration with, if you're doing a French baguette, it's like the type 55 flour. And so it's the equivalent in the United States is all-purpose flour, right? And you make your baguette, so it's basically flour, water, yeast, and salt, and that's it. It's your basic bread dough. And because of that, you get a sturdy crust and a chewy interior crumb, because you don't have anything else in there. It's devoid of fat. All right? Now, what happens if you add a little bit of fat to it? Well, what's going to happen is it's going to brown a little bit easier, and it's going to have a slight tenderizing effect. Your crust isn't going to be as crackly, and the interior crumb, the interior texture, isn't going to be as chewy. It's going to be softer. So this is more appropriate for, say, a sandwich bread, right? I love a good baguette, but if you try and make like a sandwich with a traditional baguette with like the crisp crust and the chewy interior texture, like you got to kind of be in the mood for it, right? It's not like your everyday driver for your sandwiches, right? So you have like your sliced sandwich bread, which is softer and easier to chew. Okay, so a really good example. And here's a secret tip for everyone who tunes into the podcast, right? I have a dough recipe that is basically my universal dough for almost everything, right? Now, you have your specialty doughs that if it's a really important component of a dish, you make that, right? So like we have like a potato bun that we make for our burgers. I have like a brioche bun that I make for my burger specifically because that perfect brioche bun or that perfect potato bun is a really important part of that overall dish. But if you need bread to go with something, right? You need a yeasted dumpling for your chicken and dumpling soup. If you're going that direction, you're not doing a biscuit style, right? But you're going a yeasted like biscuits or chicken and dumpling style soup. If you need to wrap some ground meat into a ball and bake it, if you need to make a loaf of soft sandwich bread, if you need to make some dinner rolls, this dough will do it for you. And your flatbreads and your pizza. And this dough is my New York style pizza dough. So if you go to stellaculinary.com/pizza, right, you will see the video where I show you how I make my New York style pizza dough and that recipe. But here's the thing, is because the dough specifically is formulated to be bready, but not like overly like chewy, and also to brown well and to be extensible and be stretchy. So it has 5% fat in it. So you take basically any dough, and it has about 65% hydration. So it's not a high hydration dough, right? And it's not really a low hydration dough. I'd say a low hydration is closer to your 60%, like your baguette, right? But your 60% hydration, a little bit of fat, 5% fat, and it's going to give you just that little bit of softness that you need for your flatbreads and for your dumplings and for everything, right? And is it going to be perfect? No, but it's a great starting point, because what it teaches you is it teaches you just that little step forward, right? From 0% fat to 5% fat, you get to realize the difference in texture, right? And how your crust browns, the sturdiness of your crust, and also the interior texture, the interior chew. And you get to see that change. So what I would do if you are really new to bread baking and you're interested in this concept is I would make a basic baguette, which I have a recipe on that as well. If you go to stellaculinary.com/SB, SB stands for Stella Bread. You'll see my whole video list. All right, so you can make our basic baguette, and then right next to it, make yourself the pizza dough, right? But then instead of making, stretching it into a pizza, portion it and roll it and form it like you would a baguette, like I demonstrate in the baguette video, and eat them side by side and see how that little bit of fat changes things. Because then when it comes down to you actually making any number of breads, right, you can add more fat or subtract more fat for textural changes. So maybe you want say you take this universal dough, this pizza dough, and you form it into a loaf, and you bake it in a loaf pan, and you slice it, and you say to yourself, I wish this was just a little bit softer. Well, okay, add more fat. Go to 10%, right? Now, there's other things that can affect this, like some your milk can weaken some gluten strands and things like that. But really, your fat is where it's at, and that's what we're gonna focus on, right? So once you go to 10%, it's going to be a softer dough, but it's still not going to be rich. It's not going to be a rich dough like a brioche, which is 30%, right? So that kind of gives you your range. 30% is on the higher end, and then your pizza dough is on like the lowest end, right? Because normally, if you're going to add less than 5% fat, you may as well just not add any fat, right? So 5% is like the entry level to fat in a dough, to where you start to see those textural and those structural changes, right? When you go to 10 to 15%, you're getting a softer dough that's more like like an enriched white bread. And then as you continue to go up, the gluten strands and the structure becomes softer and softer, denser and denser, and the dough becomes more rich. Now, beyond that, you have to take into consideration how you add your fat and when you add your fat to the dough mixture, right? So you have your baseline of your percentages. So basically you figure 5% is going to give you that first little step into tenderness to 35%, which is like the high end of enriched doughs. And at that point, the dough is really hard to handle, which is why we will drop the hydration rate a little bit, but also dropping that hydration rate is going to affect the dough's ability to cross-link proteins or your gluten by hydrating it, right? So to make that dough easier to handle, because you have a lot of fat in it, not a whole lot of gluten development, normally you'll work with that dough cold, all right? So that's why you see us putting our brioche in the fridge on that secondary bulk fermentation. So then when it comes time to divide and round it, we're working with the cold dough. It's a lot easier to handle. And when you're making, say, a biscuit dough or a pie dough, there's usually a mixing step and then a chilling step before you roll it out, right? Because if you go straight to the rolling out step, not only is the dough harder to work with, but specifically when you're incorporating that fat into something like a traditional pie crust or a biscuit dough, what do you want? Well, that's right. You want the chunks of fat, right? The butter. Because what happens is when you have those chunks of fat, either the lard or the butter or the shortening, still whole and solid in between or layered in your dough, that's how you get that separation. That's how you get a crumbly biscuit. That's how you get a crumbly pie crust, right? That's how also, too, you get the separation layers in your croissants, right? By a process called lamination, where you actually make a yeasted dough that you knead first. So it's a little bit different. So again, biscuits, pie crust, right? You're taking the cold dough and you're basically chopping it in, the flour and the cold fat, you're chopping it in. You add a little bit of liquid to bind it all together. The very classic version of this is your 3-2-1 pie crust, right? So by weight, 3 parts flour, 2 parts fat, 1 part water. So again, you're basically looking at 300 grams flour, 200 grams fat, usually butter, and 100 grams water. And you'll take... For a flaky pie crust, you'll take your flour, drop it in your food processor, add in your chunks of butter, pulse that in, and then you drizzle in your water, usually cold water, like ice water, just until it's fully incorporated, but you don't actually mix it, right? You don't need it because you don't want to create gluten structure, right? You want the dough to be tender and crumbly when you actually bake it into a pie. You don't want to eat like a chewy piece of sandwich bread. You want to eat like a pie crust, right? So that's how you get that. And it's the same basic method with cookies. Now, with a croissant, which is different, it's more like a layered sort of airy bread product. The way that you get that is by a yeasted dough that you actually knead first, and then the majority of your fat comes from a large slab of butter that you laminate in. So look up, you can Google search laminating dough, where you're basically folding the dough, you're rolling it out, you're chilling it so that butter doesn't melt and fully incorporate into the dough, because that'll mess up your structure. And after you turn it, roll it, fold it, laminate, put it back in your fridge, and you repeat that a few times. What happens is you have these very thin layers of solid fat that hasn't melted yet in between your layers of your dough. So that way, when you actually cut it, form it, and roll up your croissants, you let them proof, and you bake it in the oven. When you have the yeast, so the yeast and the steam in the dough is pushing up that croissant as it rises in your oven as you bake it, and the butter is melting into the dough, leaving you little air pockets. So that's how you get that beautiful honeycomb interior air pocket. So as you can see, just how we choose to incorporate the dough will give us different textures. If you actually allow the gluten structure to form, like in a croissant, so you're making a normal yeasted dough, and you allow the gluten structure to form, right? And then you laminate in your butter, you're going to get something that rises with spaces in between. If you don't use any yeast and you don't allow your gluten structure to form because you're kneading the bread, you're going to get more of a crumbly texture. Now, also, too, with incorporating the fat into your pie crust, you can take this the same exact 3-2-1 pie crust, but instead of making the keeping the butter cold, is you melt it, and this will get you closer to a traditional tart dough. Now, there are some more differences, but really, if you throw in a pinch of sugar and you use your 3-2-1 pie ratio, you'll get really, really close to a tart dough that works great for fruit tarts or galettes or things of that nature, right? Where you want it to eat a little bit more cohesively and almost more like a Danish. But I mean, most of you know what a tart dough tastes like. or a galette dough tastes like, right? So it's a little bit more cohesive, less crumbly, right? But it's still very, very rich. And so the way that you do that is because the butter is now melted, you don't have these pockets of solid fat in this dough that are going to melt and leave you those gaps, right? So you're now incorporating it. But the way that we incorporate it is we incorporate the melted butter into the dough before we add the water. And what this does is it will actually coat the gluten strands or basically the gluten and gliadin. So it's technically not even gluten yet, right? So you have two separate proteins in your dough. You have the gluten and the gliadin, right? The fat will coat these strands, keep them from cross-linking, and there still will be a certain amount of cross-linking depending upon how much you work the dough and how much moisture you add, but it's going to greatly reduce the cross-linking ability of the gluten and gliadin. So you're going to have a much reduced gluten network formation, right? Which is going to result in a tender crust. So melted butter goes in, you pulse it in your food processor, you add the water, again, you pulse it until you have a cohesive dough, and you let it rest, and you can roll that out and make a tart dough. A really easy thing to do with this is you just do a free form, you don't even need to really cut it into rings, but you can if you want. But you roll out this dough and you make galettes. Slice up some apples, toss them in a little bit of sugar. You can toss just a tiny bit of cornstarch in there to keep the liquid from weeping out when you bake it, right? But it's really just, apples, whatever fruits you want, a little bit of sugar, a little bit of cornstarch to keep everything kind of held together. Not a whole lot because you don't want it super starchy. And then you just lay out your round of your galette dough, and you just kind of crimp the edges around. So it just gives you a little container with an open top, and you bake it, right? Brush it with some butter, or if you want like a shiny sort of crust, you brush it with some egg yolk, sprinkle with a little bit of the large sugar crystal, maybe a little bit of sea salt. You bake it. It's a really simple galette, right? And it's a great dessert. Throw some ice cream on top. Everyone loves it. It's homemade. It looks all rustic. Okay. So as you can see, by how we add the fat, incorporate the fat, and at what stage we add the fat, it's going to affect the texture of our dough. So then you kind of extrapolate that out to brioche. And that's why you'll see in my brioche video, we actually take our brioche dough and we knead the dough first to allow gluten development, right? We hydrate it, we autolyse, we knead it, we start that gluten development because we're going to have so much fat, so much richness in this brioche dough. We need the help from the gluten to hold it together, all right? So then once the dough has formed and we've formed a little bit of a gluten structure, now we take our room temperature butter and we drop it into this brioche dough and we finish the kneading process. After we're done kneading and we have a decent gluten development, we'll take that and we'll chill it down in the fridge during our bulk fermentation. So I normally will leave it out at room temperature for 30 to 45 minutes if it's not too hot, right? If it's too hot in my kitchen, I'll either find a cooler environment or I'll go straight to the fridge with it, because what will happen is that that fat will start to completely melt and separate, which is not what you want. You don't want liquefied fat in your brioche. You want very, very soft fat, right? So that's why you have the room temperature butter. Take that, pop it in your fridge. Best case scenario, you let it bulk ferment overnight. So you let it rise in your fridge overnight. Long, slow rise. It's going to help to develop those flavors. And then the next day, when it comes time to work with it, you scale it, you form it into balls, whether it's little small guys for some dinner rolls, or you can form it into hamburger buns. You can do the traditional brioche mold where you kind of poke the hole in it and you pull the thing through, put it in a little fluted mold container. Right, so that's your brioche dough. And you kind of see the same thing universally in different applications, right? So the same thing with if you go to stellaculinary.com/pizza, you'll see the difference between my New York style pizza dough and the Chicago style dough, where the Chicago style dough, you still want a yeasted dough. So I don't want my dough personally for my Chicago style pizza to eat like a pie crust or like a biscuit. Some people argue that that's how they want it. I would agree with them, but then we'd both be wrong. Okay, I don't give a shit what you think. I don't want it to eat like a frickin' pie. Now, here's the thing. Here's the great thing about cooking and understanding the basics. If you want your Chicago style pizza crust to eat like a biscuit, I just gave you the details of how to make it eat like a biscuit, right? Easy. So that's the thing. It's all built on personal preferences. And that's why I always try and stress knowing the underlying reasons why you do something. So if you're like, Jake, you know what the fuck you're talking about. I want my pizza dough to be biscuity. Well, cool. Now you have the information and the technique to make it biscuity. But when I make my Chicago-style pizza dough, I like it to be tender. I like it to be somewhat crispy, right? But I don't want it to eat like an actual pie crust. So what I do is I will start by incorporating the melted butter and olive oil at 30%, so 20% melted butter, 10% light olive oil. I incorporate that into the flour first to coat the flour so I don't have a ton of gluten development. Then I add in my water and my yeast to hydrate the dough, and I'll still knead the dough like a normal dough because I want some gluten development in it, right? And then I'll let it rise, but by the time you press it down and bake it, you're going to have a completely different texture than you would if it was your standard Sicilian pizza crust or a New York style pizza crust. Then we're going to finish this whole thing off with tongzong and pâte à choux, right? And this is, I'm only going to touch briefly on this because the segments are already going long and we could fill up hours with both tongzong and pâte à choux. But what both of those do is they pre-gelatinize the starches in your dough. Right, and by pre-gelatinizing the starches, it allows you to, number one, add more liquid, which is going to give you a softer texture, but also it keeps the gluten from forming, and it holds on to more moisture, right? So think of, you take, imagine in your head, you take a bowl of cornstarch, right? And you add water to it and you stir it so it's liquidy, right? It's very, very fluid. And then you take that same bowl of water and cornstarch and you heat it over high heat. It turns into a pudding, right? A very moist sort of smack in your mouth sort of pudding. Okay, same thing happens with both pâte à choux and tongzong. Tongzong is the Japanese technique of taking a portion of your flour and a portion of your liquid and cooking it in a pot, which pre-gelatinizes it. Now, this is going to make it possible for you to add more moisture to your overall dough, and that pre-gelatinization is going to make your bread dough super, super soft. Now, pâte à choux, which is a French technique, is similar, except instead of taking a portion of your dough, you take all of your dough, right? You take all of, or a portion of your flour. You take all of your flour, and the way that you start it is, so traditionally for, say, like a dessert-style pâte à choux, which is your base for cream puffs and things of that nature, is you take your liquid, usually milk, and some butter. You melt it in a pot, you bring it to a simmer, then you dump in your flour. Okay, dump in your flour, stir it. You're going to cook for about 60 seconds over moderate heat until it fully gelatinizes. And you take this and you move that to a stand mixer, and while the dough is still hot, you beat in one egg at a time, depending, and the amount of egg you add is based on the recipe and the size of the batch that you're making, right? So you beat in these eggs with a paddle attachment, and the heat from the dough cooks the eggs partially, but also because what did we do by basically pre-gelatinizing our flour in the liquid with the fat? Well, we completely degraded the dough's ability to have any sort of gluten structure. Versus in tongzong, you're only taking a portion of that flour and that water, pre-gelatinizing it, and then adding it to the rest of your dough, which has some gluten structure. With pâte à choux, we're completely removing that gluten structure by heating the flour directly. So we wait till we don't even let it hydrate at all, right? If we combine the flour and the liquid together while it was cold, you would still have a little tiny bit of gluten development. But by heating the liquid and the fat together, then adding in the flour and stirring that, you're not only adding in fat, which we know disrupts the gluten structure and brings richness, but you're also completely taking away the glutenins and gliadins' ability to cross-link and form a gluten structure. So this gives you a really tender dough. So we add in the egg because now the egg is adding the protein structure that we need for that dough to not be flat and flabby, right? So we still want our dough to puff. Now you take this, you chill it down. If you pipe it out onto a baking tray and bake it, you get cream puffs, or you get the base for, cream puffs are not cream puffs until you fill them with pastry cream or whatever else you're doing. This is where you get eclairs from. You can also, and this is another great universal dough, you nail a pâte à choux, right? Now you can take this dough, you can pipe it into a ring, let it chill in your fridge, and you can deep fry it, right? And now you have a pâte à choux donut, which is great. You take the same dough out of a just a normal piping bag, cut a hole about this size, and you start to squeeze it into hot oil, about 350, cutting as you go. Makes really amazing beignets, right? Dusting a little bit of powdered sugar. And this is different than like the yeasted, risen beignets, right? So you have your pâte à choux based beignets, and you have your yeasted and risen beignets, right? So, but this can make really great donut holes. It's a really quick and easy dessert. You want to impress people. One of my go-to desserts when I was a chef and I didn't have a pastry chef that I could lean on to do a lot of production was I would do coffee and donuts, right? And it's super simple. And if you search coffee and donuts on stellaculinary.com, you'll see there's still a recipe there. And basically what it was is I would make I would take espresso and some chocolate and some coffee and some sugar, and I would blend it up while it was hot. Use a little bit of xanthan gum to stabilize it, and I would emulsify in some butter. So you have this nice, rich, chocolatey coffee sauce. It's kind of like a dessert version of a mocha, right? And I'd hold that hot, and then I would take a pastry bag with my pâte à choux in it, and I would pipe it into hot water, clipping it as I go. Not hot water, excuse me, hot oil, clipping it as I go. And I'd fry little donut holes, take it while they're still hot, drain them, goes into a bowl of cinnamon and sugar. You toss it up, put it on a plate with a little cute little cappuccino cup of this dipping sauce. They dip. This is something that you could easily do at home. You serve dinner, you guys are hanging out, maybe you take a half-hour break. You heat up a little pot of oil on a little induction burner, right? It doesn't need to be a big deal. And you just clip some donut holes. You fry them fresh, and the visual, the aroma, everything is just going to sell really big. So now you take this same dough, the same pâte à choux dough, you do a savory version of it. So instead of adding sugar and sweetness, well, really with pâte à choux, you normally don't add sugar anyways, but you could. But instead of doing milk, right, you can now do water. You still want a little bit of fat. And now you throw in some little tablespoon of Dijon and throw in some herbs. You bring it to a simmer. You add in your flour. Then you beat in your eggs. And then this becomes Parisian gnocchi. So instead of frying it, now you take the same, basically a savory version of your pâte à choux, which you can add herbs to. You can add grated cheese to, right? Pecorino, whatever you want. And you incorporate that into your pâte à choux dough. You clip this into simmering water, same way as we did with our donut holes, but instead of frying, you're dropping into simmering water, right? They'll puff, they float, you skim those off, you put them on a sheet tray with a little bit of oil, set them aside, right? And that's your Parisian gnocchi. On the pickup, you take the Parisian gnocchi, throw it in a pan with some oil and some butter, saute around until they're brown and crispy. You can throw in some mushrooms, you can throw in some other stuff if you want, and that's how you get your Parisian gnocchi. And so you can see by just by starting off at a really basic baguette, okay, we start at a very basic baguette, and we start adding fat. And then not only do we add fat at different ratios, right, in that 5 to 35% zone, but then the way in which we incorporate that fat, whether we're adding it melted, adding it at room temperature, adding it cold, cooking the flour into it, all affects how the dough changes, right? Okay, we are going to go through your questions here real quick. The high hydration slap and pull method to develop the gluten, how much of the change from the sticky mess to well-formed loaf is from evaporation? 0. You don't have a lot of evaporation there. And you can do the slap and fold or stretch and folds with super high hydration doughs. Yeah, people are obsessed with the Martin's potato buns, which is an East Coast thing, which is cool. The famous yellow butter. I have an application that you put the percentage of the ingredient, and the application tells you how much you will need according to the final mass you want. Yeah, I have a recipe calculator like that as well that I built in Excel. Sounds like churros. Yeah. So Rodrigo brings up a great point. So those same donut holes that we made with our pâte à choux, you put a star tip on them. You now here's a couple of things. If you want sort of a not so straight and kind of more, if you're okay with like a twisty turny churro, you can just pipe it through the star tip directly into your hot oil, clipping it off, and it's going to expand and kind of curl up. It's also very similar to a funnel cake, so you can take a smaller hole, maybe a little bit of a wetter pâte à choux dough, and spiral it in, and you're into the hot oil, and you're going to get a funnel cake. Now, if you want a straight churro, what you want to do is take your same pâte à choux, put a star tip on your piping bag, have a sheet tray with a silpat, and then pipe the churros to whatever length you want, and then freeze them. And once they're frozen solid, you take them straight from frozen, you drop them into your hot oil, and that is going to set the shape before they heat all the way through. Take them out, toss them in cinnamon and sugar, and serve them right away. All right. So I appreciate everyone tuning in. We will be doing this again next week at 7 a.m. and with hopefully some new studio equipment coming my way. And we'll have a couple more screens set up so I can look at your comments a little bit better. Discord, I know I've kind of ignored you guys. It's not on purpose, but we've just been rocking and rolling this episode. So I'll try and do a better job of getting to the Discord chat next time. And I will be taking this. It's going to take some time, but you will see on the Stella Culinary live YouTube channel, you'll start seeing some segments come out. So I think the bread segment will be a great segment to do. Maybe we'll even chop that up to a couple of different segments. And then we'll have the professional chef series. So you can watch this in a segmented fashion. So don't forget to subscribe to the audio feed. Don't forget to subscribe to the actual Stella Culinary Live YouTube channel. So that's different from my technique channel. So if you go to youtube.com/Jacob Burton, that's just all my cooking techniques, right? Where I shoot me cooking in the kitchen, I voice it over. They're a lot shorter, a lot cleaner, right? If you want to watch these podcasts on a replay, you can watch the whole thing by going to YouTube and searching Stella Culinary Live. Subscribe to that because within that same channel, I will be dropping different clips, right? So then you'll be able to go back and reference the older clips when you're just looking for a single piece of information. For those of you who are like me and really enjoy listening to audio podcasts on the go, I mean, when I'm working, when I'm on a bike, when I'm running, I'm always listening to audio podcasts. I love it. It's a great way to learn. I can do stuff. I can garden. I can drive to work, while I'm getting new information piped into my ears. It's really an amazing part of the world that we live in. So for those of you who like to consume this in its original format, which it started as an audio podcast on all the major platforms, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, just go in, search Stella Culinary. If you have a specific podcast app that you like and you're not seeing Stella Culinary in there, shoot me an email, jacob@stellaculinary.com. I'll look into it. But we're pretty good at getting this distributed out to all the major platforms. And that way, you can consume this on the go without sitting in front of a computer screen or a TV screen for an hour, hour and a half. So with that said, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope everyone has a fantastic weekend. I will be chatting along with you all in the Facebook group as the weekend progresses. And I hope everyone cooks something delicious. See you next week.